Before entering the story, please subscribe to the channel, like and share to help me. Thank you. Israel and Palestine. The dark Bible root of a 4,000-year feud. The Israel-Palestine conflict stretches far beyond a modern border dispute. It's woven into the spiritual fabric of human history. For many Christians, it's not just about land. It's a cosmic, divine battle that spans roughly 4,000 years. Ancient prophecies, sacred promises, these have shaped this perpetual struggle. Today, we dive deep into the biblical underpinnings of this age-old feud. Could the origins of this conflict be far deeper than history books suggest? Hidden in arcane prophecy and divine covenant, we're following breadcrumbs laid by prophets and courts, and what we discover might challenge everything we thought we knew, and the invisible strings from ancient scrolls that continue to tug at modern politics. It's a journey through time, revealing how scripture still echoes in today's headlines. Imagine a patriarch, old and restless. He and Sarah possess only a single promise, and yet Sarah remains barren. That promise is the child God has yet to fulfill. In this series, we'll examine the promises that defined a people, the prophecies that shaped nations. A shadow follows that promise. Division. The question, is eternity truly the same? Your support fuels this channel, and if you'd like to pitch in, super thanks at the end means the world. Ready to uncover what lies beneath this ancient mystery? Let's go. Hang tight, hit that subscribe button if you're new, and if you feel this topic resonates, drop 666 in the comments. For Jews, the moment marks centuries of exile, ghettos, pogroms, and finally, freedom. For Palestinians, statehood was a dream of equity, not a restoration built on biblical footing. Militias clashed, homes burned, thousands were dead or jailed. It didn't solve anything, it hardened tribal lines. Would people believe those ancient words lived on? Let sounds of distant gunfire in 1948. It's a question as urgent as ever. Villages emptied overnight, keys swinging, memories immortalized in what was once home. They watched waves of Jewish immigrants arrive, spiking fears that land would once again slip from their grasp, fueled by a fresh wave of anti-Semitism in Europe. But during those same hours, Palestinian families cradled babies in fleeing cars. For Palestinians, this wasn't history, it's living memory. The right to return became core to identity, protests, politics, and perhaps the most bitter thorn between two peoples. Narratives shaped from two opposing memories, both convinced they stand on sacred truth. Over 700,000 Palestinians were uprooted, some escaping, others forced out by Israeli operations like Plan Dalit. Many thought, this is temporary, but their homes vanished just beyond tomorrow's borders. On paper, it looked neat. In reality, especially to Palestinian Arabs, it was a blow, a raw sting of colonial arrogancy, European power, slicing up the Middle East. A state reborn, Jerusalem, olive groves, dusty market lanes, they were more than home. They were a feeling of historical reclamation. And when later the vote passed, the deep sense that ancient prophecy collided with justice exploded into violence. Out comes Ishmael, born of that union, a seismic moment. What Abraham felt then, hope, doubt, doubt again. Israel and Palestine. The dark Bible root of a 4,000-year feud. Music fades. The promise in Abraham's tent, long before modern armies or UN resolutions, long before tanks, wire fences, or refugee camps. The true fault line lay in Abraham's tent. After years of waiting, in desperation, Sarah gives Abraham her servant, Hagar, to bear a son. A covenant is formed. To your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great Euphrates. That promise is echoed again through the Exodus and under King David, who builds Jerusalem into a spiritual heartland. But in Genesis 15:18-21, God steps in. The Old Testament repeatedly points to this covenant. Land wasn't just real estate, it was sacred inheritance, yours forever. But Scripture isn't blind to heartbreak, so pay attention. This ancient story is still being lived on modern streets. The next act might surprise you. The 20th century flashpoint. Fast forward to 1948, a year that cleaved the Middle East along an emotional precipice. Yet those same hills were sacred to another people. Tensions boiled, erupting in the Arab Revolt of 1936-39. British troops imposed curfews. Pause and consider. Religious promises made millennia spoken to. Abraham could influence life and death decisions in the 20th century. Partition and the pain of 1948, the solution came via bold paperwork, the UN Partition Plan, to states Jewish and Arab. Jerusalem under international administration, a buffer zone. Arab leaders cried betrayal. They argued the whole land was theirs by right. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel. Below Tel Aviv's flags, Jewish communities celebrated. What kind of inheritance is this, when land becomes a place you once knew and are no longer allowed to return? That became Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. Closing thoughts. The events of 1948 didn't just draw lines on maps. They carved deep wounds. For Jews, independence. For Palestinians, exile. How do you find peace when both sides pray to the same God, read the same scriptures and see different truths everywhere? The Six-Day War. A nation reborn. A people displaced by the time the calendar turned to 1967. The wounds of 1948 still pulse through the Middle East. For Israel, the state was a lifeboat, surrounded by enemies. They taught their children stories of homes they had never seen, stories passed like heirlooms. The keys to lost homes became symbols of identity. Meanwhile, Israeli leaders watched nervously as enemies gathered strength at every border. Arab nations, furious over the Nakba, pledged that Israel's existence must not continue. For Palestinians, the wound of displacement was now generational. Every morning, Palestinian refugees woke up in camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, or Syria. Tensions escalated quickly. Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's access to the Red Sea. Syrian artillery rained down from the Golan Heights, and Jordan mobilized across the West Bank. The message was clear. War was coming. The lightning storm. June 5, 1967. Then, in a daring, preemptive strike, Israel launched Operation Fukusa Swift, a devastating air assault that grounded the Egyptian Air Force before it even got off the runway. Within 6 days, Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It wasn't just a military victory. It redrew the entire map of the Middle East. In just under a week, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. Some families became refugees for the second time in a generation. Israeli forces now controlled millions of Palestinians, and the occupation began. The Golan Heights from Syria and Gaza, once under Egyptian control across the newly captured West Bank and Gaza Strip, Israeli communities began to rise. Red-roofed houses, paved roads, schools. They weren't just homes, they were statements. Israel was no longer a state surviving against aggression. It had become an occupying power. With each new settlement, trust eroded further. Suddenly, Israel's borders ballooned, but so did its responsibilities to Palestinians and much of the watching world. They were a legal attempt to permanently reshape the map and deny the possibility of a future Palestinian state. Jerusalem and divided again, but the language was vague and interpretations varied. Israel held the land. Palestinians were now living under military rule. The conflict had reached a new dimension. What had once been a dream of nationhood now became a daily grind of permits, surveillance, and uncertainty. Israeli paratroopers wept at the Western Wall, touching stones their ancestors had longed for over centuries of exile. This was more than military, it was prophetic. The United States backed Israel politically and militarily, while the Soviet Union armed Arab states, like Egypt and Syria, their future a prayer for return. Children were born in tents. Entire generations grew up in makeshift homes, no nationality, no passport, no promise of return, and always, the key hung on the wall, waiting. The Six-Day War didn't just shake the region, it shifted alliances worldwide, through displacement, through suffering. And what does justice look like when two peoples believe they are living out a divine narrative? For Jews around the world, the moment they'd prayed for had finally come. A sense of divine favor seemed confirmed. Generations had dreamed of Jerusalem, now it was theirs. Jerusalem, once again in Jewish hands, echoed prophecies of Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Daniel. Was this divine choreography? Ezekiel's vision of dry bones coming to life now felt eerily present. Could this be the moment when Israel stepped fully back into its prophetic role? Perhaps only something higher than politics, a kind of divine mercy, can untangle the web left by this war. In Christian circles, many saw the recapture of East Jerusalem as the fulfillment of God's ancient promise, a sign that end prophecies were stirring. It deepened faith for some, ignited sorrow for others. It redefined maps and dreams, and perhaps most hauntingly, it left no real ending. But for Palestinians, it was catastrophe layered upon catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands more were displaced. Refugee camps swelled. Both peoples now held even more tightly to their identity, built not just on history, but on wounds. Israel had gained land, but at what cost? How does a nation founded on survival begin to rule over another people who do not want you there? And for Palestinians, how do you respond when every effort at independence seems buried under bulldozers, barbed wire, and checkpoints? Occupation and settlement. A new struggle emerges in the months and years following the war. Something else began to unfold. Too many Israelis. These were not just towns, they were fulfilling biblical claims to Judea and Samaria, the ancestral heartland. This new phase deepened the divide. Global powers in play, the Cold War was raging, and the Middle East became one more arena in the global chess game. The UN called for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories in Resolution 242, emphasizing the inadmissibility of acquiring land by war. The psychological shift, the Six-Day War, altered more than maps, it altered hearts and minds. In Israel, it was a moment of destiny, but with victory came moral dilemmas. Daily life began to change. Movement was restricted. Economies collapsed. Families were separated. The refugee legacy continues from 1948 to 1967, and now beyond. Palestinian refugees remain the world's largest stateless population. What does it do to a people when their very existence becomes an identity of loss? For many Palestinians, their lives became a protest, prophecy, or politics. In Christian circles, the events of 1967 were seen by some as an acceleration toward the Second Coming. Yet, even among believers, the questions loomed. Can God's plan unfold through war? The unfinished story. The Six-Day War was more than a victory, it became the pivot point of the modern Middle East. The land remained under occupation. Peace deals were proposed, but never stuck. And Palestinians, many of them born after 1967, grew up with no memory of a homeland they never saw, only a longing stitched into their DNA. Was there ever a way forward, or had the paths already been sealed by ancient stories and modern tragedies? So we leave this chapter on sacred ground. The Temple Mount, the Western Wall, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, standing as symbols of victory, faith, loss, and longing, aftermath and identity. The battle for narrative, the Six-Day War, may have lasted less than a week, but its consequences have spanned generations. What Israel gained in territory, it also inherited in complexity. Millions of Palestinians now lived under its control. The battlefield moved from tanks and trenches to stories, symbols, and daily life. Now, the question wasn't just who won, but whose version of history would shape the future. Across the West Bank, in areas biblically known as Judea and Samaria, Israeli civilians began establishing communities, some secular, others deeply religious. They believed they were returning to their ancestral heartland. The borders were wider, but the moral terrain was harder to navigate. What one side saw as prophecy fulfilled, the other experienced as occupation deepened. From Tel Aviv to Ramallah, the war didn't end, it simply changed form. Birth of the settler movement in Israel. The Six-Day War became a mythic chapter, national redemption after 2,000 years of exile. School children learned of the miracles. Paratroopers became legends. Jerusalem was whole again. In the immediate wake of victory, a bold and controversial idea took hold. Settlement. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded. To Israel, it was seen as a terror organization bent on their destruction. Violence escalated, hijackings, bombings, retaliatory strikes. The conflict spilled into neighboring countries. The Middle East became a powder keg. Initially a secular movement, it called for the liberation of all Palestinian land, even if that meant dismantling Israel. Too many settlers. This wasn't colonization, it was restoration. The Western Wall, once guarded by Jordanian soldiers, was now open for prayer. The city of David was again in Jewish hands. The names were ancient Hebron, Bethel, Shiloh, places where Abraham once walked, where Jacob dreamed, and where David ruled. The spiritual center of their lives was suddenly under someone else's authority. It felt like humiliation layered on top of loss, and all the while, ordinary people, Israeli and Palestinian, tried to live between the headlines. Children grew up with sirens instead of lullabies. Grief became a second language. For millions of believers, 1967 wasn't just a turning point in history, it was a sign from heaven. The Bible wasn't just a book, it was a blueprint. Was God's plan unfolding, or were humans just repeating the same cycles of injustice? To them, the return of the Jews to Jerusalem wasn't politics, it was prophecy fulfilled, when both point to sacred texts, ancient promises, and buried ancestors. When soil is soaked in scripture, it carries the weight of eternity. Every stone, every border, every olive tree is charged with meaning. 730 passages from Ezekiel 37, Isaiah 11, and Daniel 9 were quoted in sermons across America and Europe. But for Palestinians, each new house, each paved road was a reminder of erasure. Each side carried its own scars, its own version of justice. And in a place where memory is sacred, forgetting becomes a kind of treason. The land that might have become a future homeland was now being carved away parcel by parcel, checkpoint by checkpoint. Parents trying to get their children to school, farmers tending to groves, shopkeepers opening shutters each morning, wondering if today will bring peace or panic. There were treaties like with Egypt in 1979, but they were cold, transactional. Could any one of them ever fully claim it without crushing the hopes of the others? After 1967, the world saw clear maps but blurred morality. The victory was real, and so was the sorrow. Israel stood stronger than ever. Palestinians stood more displaced than ever. International law condemned these settlements, but they kept growing. The knacks, the setback, another chapter in a long book of displacement and betrayal. Their children, born in refugee camps or under occupation, memorized the names of villages lost in 1948 and again in 1967. Memory became resistance. Red-roofed Israeli suburbs now stood beside Palestinian villages separated by fences and armed patrols. A tale of two nations. As the land changed, so did the stories. But in Palestinian homes, a different story was told. Here lies the tragedy. Both peoples were telling true stories, but they were opposing truths. And in between those stories stood walls both concrete and psychological. The rise of Palestinian nationalism 330. In response to the new reality, Palestinian nationalism began to take organized shape. Too many in the Arab world, the pillar was a symbol of defiance and dignity. Each act of violence birthed new grievances, fresh funerals, deeper rage. Jerusalem, sacred and divided, and always now entirely under Israeli control, it stood as a shining symbol for one people and a painful loss for another. For Jews, this was the fulfillment of God's ancient promise. But for Palestinians especially, Muslims, the Al-Aqsa mosque compound, known as the Haram al-Sharif, was now watched by Israeli police. Three faiths claimed this city. One piece of land, seen through three sacred lenses: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Faith and prophecy collide within evangelical Christian circles. The events of 1967 sparked theological books like The Late Great Planet Earth hit bestseller lists, tying modern Israel directly to the second coming of Christ. But even among Christians, tension remained. How could a prophecy bring blessing to one people while another endured such suffering? The burden of holy ground, the land, was never ordinary. It never could be. But what happens when two peoples believe that God gave them the same land? It's no longer just a conflict. It's a theological impasse. And yet underneath all the prophecy and politics live ordinary people. The cold peace after the Six-Day War, Israel emerged as the dominant military power in the region. Yet even with that strength, peace remained elusive. Trust was a fragile thing. No one had truly forgotten the wars, the betrayals, the body counts. So, here we are. Two peoples, one land, and a history that refuses to rest. And in between, deep, ancient, blood-soaked stories, uprising and broken promises. When hope shattered in the years following 1967, the conflict over Israel and Palestine shifted again. Not in borders, but in mood and hearts. Peace felt more distant than ever. Permits, checkpoints, curfews, military raids, these weren't just headlines, they were life. Two peoples now lived under one sky, but in increasingly separate realities. In 1987, the world witnessed the spark of the first Intifada uprising that caught even the most seasoned leaders off guard. For Palestinians, life under occupation was no longer temporary. It became a grinding, daily experience. And beneath that life, something began to stir. A generation raised on exile and loss now raised their voices. Stones replaced silence. Anger replaced fear. It wasn't orchestrated from military command centers. It rose from classrooms, alleyways, refugee camps. Israeli forces responded with rubber bullets, tear gas, and sometimes live fire. The world watched with horror and confusion. But it wasn't just about a crash, it was a match thrown into dry tinder. Protests spread like wildfire. The first Intifada, a cry from the streets. It began in the Gaza Strip. A traffic collision between an Israeli truck and a Palestinian car left 4 people dead. 2 bitter enemies sat at a table. For the first time, the Palestine Liberation Organization recognized Israel's right to exist. In return, Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. For years, their narrative had been buried beneath regional politics and Cold War calculations. But now, children with slingshots were on the evening news. Behind closed doors, whispers of peace began to take shape. On the White House lawn, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands, flanked by Bill Clinton. Peace seemed not just possible, it seemed imminent. Palestinians would gain limited self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Israeli troops would gradually withdraw. Final borders would be negotiated in 5 years. And the question shifted from who's right to how did it come to this? On the Israeli side, radical settlers and right-wing politicians feared giving up what they saw as sacred land. A wave of suicide bombings by Hamas followed, triggering more Israeli military responses. Trust evaporated. On the Palestinian side, groups like Hamas rejected Oslo entirely, calling it a surrender to occupation. Palestinian youth, armed with stones, confronted Israeli soldiers. Graffiti bloomed across walls, declaring freedom. This wasn't a war fought with tanks. It was street to street, house to house, heart to heart. The streets that once held dreams of peace now ran with blood. Oslo's paper promises turned to ash. Over 1,000 Palestinians were killed, along with around 160 Israelis. Thousands more were injured. The occupation became impossible to justify on moral grounds. Grief had become the only language. Both sides spoke fluently. Suicide bombings rocked Israeli buses, cafes, and markets. Israel responded with airstrikes, tanks, and reoccupations of major Palestinian cities. They called it a security fence. Palestinians called it an apartheid wall. To Palestinians, it meant a scar across their land, cutting through olive groves, separating families and trapping entire villages behind concrete. Suddenly, the world could no longer ignore the Palestinian voice. Geography was now reinforcing theology. Hope was fenced in. Grief roamed free. What followed became known as the Second Intifada. A shift in tactics, a shift in perception, but what it really did was deepen the wounds that made identity unshakable and compromise unthinkable. And when the talks at Camp David collapsed, hope collapsed with them. Palestinians saw it as proof that even when they were given autonomy, they were still punished, still isolated, still occupied, this time by siege instead of soldiers. Walls, both real and emotional, make it hard to imagine a shared future. But still some whisper the dream. Israel, along with Egypt, imposed a strict blockade. Rockets began flying. Retaliations followed. Gaza became an open-air prison, its skies lit by explosions, its children growing up surrounded by rubble. The first Intifada lasted for 6 years, and under international pressure, something unexpected happened. Dialogue. It remembers. It resents. It repeats. In 1993, under the quiet snow of Oslo, Norway, a secret set of negotiations unfolded. Oslo Accords. A moment of fragile hope. The world watched in amazement. The Oslo Accords called for a phased plan toward a two-state solution. It felt like history bending toward justice, but almost immediately, cracks appeared. Extremists on both sides viewed compromise as betrayal. A peace killed by extremes in 1995. Just 2 years after Oslo, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli ultranationalista Jew who believed peace threatened God's covenant. That single bullet may have killed more than a man. It shook the foundation of the peace process. By the time final status talks rolled around in 2000, both sides were bruised, wary, and deeply suspicious. The Second Intifada. Desperation turns violent. Soon after the failed talks, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon made a controversial visit to the Temple Mount. Haram al-Sharifa, move Palestinians saw as a deliberate provocation. This time, the violence was far more intense and far more deadly. Between 2000 and 2005, over 4,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed. And in the middle of it all, fear. Israeli children afraid to board buses, Palestinian families afraid to leave their homes, building walls, building distance. In response to the Second Intifada, Israel began constructing a separation barrier along and within the West Bank. To Israelis, it meant fewer bombings, fewer funerals. Whatever you called it, the symbolism was clear. Walls were replacing dialogue. Gaza, from occupation to isolation. In 2005, Israel made a bold move. It withdrew from Gaza, removing all settlements and military presence. For a moment, it looked like progress, but soon after, the militant group Hamas gained political control of Gaza. The narrative hardened again. Israelis saw Gaza as a terror launchpad, identity hardened by pain. Here's the tragic irony. Every act of violence was meant to defend identity. Children on both sides were taught not just history but trauma. And trauma doesn't debate. It doesn't negotiate. The question becomes painfully clear. Can people ever share land when their memories of that land are soaked in opposite pain? The two-state solution, once a hopeful vision, now feels like a ghost. The world watches. Diplomacy, delay, and the power of nations. While the streets of Gaza burned and Jerusalem wept, the world watched and intervened. This was never just a local conflict. Not when the land held religious meaning for half the planet. Not when oil, war, and ideologies swirled around it like desert wind. The Israeli-Palestinian story became a global drama played out in the halls of the United Nations, the chambers of Congress, and the backrooms of world capitals. Everyone had a stake. Everyone had an opinion, but not everyone understood the weight of what they were trying to shape. The bond was built on shared democratic ideals, Cold War strategy, and increasingly evangelical Christian support. The American alliance, blessing or blind spot, most ended with more wars, more blood, and more blame. Israel became one of America's strongest allies, while Palestinians often viewed Washington as an obstacle, not an honest broker. Since the late 1960s, the United States emerged as Israel's closest and most consistent ally. After the Yom Kippur War of 1973, US President Jimmy Carter brought together Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat at Camp David. By the 1980s, US aid to Israel reached billions of dollars annually. Advanced weaponry, political cover in the UN, strategic military cooperation. And for many in the Arab world, Sadat's signature was a betrayal. The Madrid Conference of 1991 brought Israelis and Palestinians to a joint table under the watch of the US and Soviet Union, a vision for two states, side by side. For a brief moment, peace had a roadmap and a rhythm. Trust wasn't strong enough. Extremists on both sides were loud enough. And the US, though central, wasn't impartial enough. He was assassinated 3 years later by extremists within his own country. And yet America also tried to mediate peace. Every president from Carter to Biden appointed envoys, convened summits, floated roadmaps. Some came heartbreakingly close. It was a landmark moment, the first Arab nation to make peace with the Jewish state. Camp David, 1978. Cold peace, warm hands. The first real diplomatic breakthrough came not between Israel and Palestinians but between Israel and Egypt. After nearly 2 weeks of tense talks, they emerged with a deal. Egypt would recognize Israel. Israel would withdraw from the Sinai. But Palestinians weren't at the table. Their fate was discussed but not decided by others, but condemned across the Arab world and seen by Palestinians as the death of neutrality. Madrid and Oslo. Hope flares, then fades to Palestinians. It often felt like favoritism dressed as diplomacy. Fast forward to the early 1990s. The Cold War had ended, and with it came a fresh opportunity. But it was the Oslo Accords in 1993 that lit the world's imagination. Secret talks in Norway. Historic handshakes. The Palestinian issue was no longer the unifying cause of the Arab world. It had become a side note. Economies needed growth. Iran became the region's new bogeyman. Over 80 resolutions condemned Israeli settlement expansion, military operations, or treatment of Palestinians. Yet they were almost always vetoed by the United States in the Security Council, and quiet conversations began. For Israel, it often felt like a hostile theater where their legitimacy was questioned. Countries like Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon fought wars, closed embassies, and championed the Palestinian cause. And in 2020, under the Abraham Accords, the floodgates opened. UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan all normalized ties. But without military or economic leverage over Israel, their voice faded into the background. But when that rhythm broke, when settlements expanded and suicide bombings returned, the hope unraveled. They issued a roadmap toward a two-state solution. America's shifting role, each administration approached the conflict differently. George W. Bush was the first to explicitly endorse a Palestinian state, but also heavily backed Israel's right to self-defense post 9/11. It was about memory, trauma, faith, and identity. Things that can't be brokered by handshakes or treaties alone. But the truth is, the deeper wounds lie not in the capitals of the world, but in the soil of Jerusalem, in the refugee camps of Gaza, in the memories of mothers who've buried their children. Movements like If Not No and Jewish Voice for Peace challenge blind support for Israeli policy, while still affirming the right of the Jewish people to a homeland. Barack Obama pressed for a freeze on Israeli settlements, but faced fierce domestic backlash and strained relations with Israeli leadership. Donald Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing it as Israel's capital, a decision cheered in Israel. To Israelis, American support was a lifeline, and still every U.S. president repeated the mantra: two states, living side by side in peace. But the ground kept shifting. The facts on the ground made that vision harder to see. The Arab world. From war to normalization in the early decades, the Arab world stood in unified opposition to Israel. But over time, interests changed. In 1994, Jordan became the second Arab nation to sign a peace treaty with Israel. These were celebrated in Washington and Tel Aviv as progress. But in Ramallah and Gaza, they felt like abandonment. The United Nations. Resolutions without results. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, a different drama unfolded. For Palestinians, the UN offered validation but not protection. Words echoed in chambers, but they rarely echoed in action. Europe and the Quartet, a chorus, not a conductor. The European Union played a quieter role, funding humanitarian aid, supporting Palestinian institutions, and occasionally issuing stern statements. In 2002, the Quartet was formed, comprised of the US, EU, UN, and Russia to coordinate peace efforts. But roadmaps require drivers, and this one stalled. The burden of outsiders. Every outside effort, whether driven by idealism, strategy, or theology, has left fingerprints on this land. Some brought breakthrough, some brought betrayal, some simply brought confusion. Global actors tried to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict like a puzzle, but this wasn't just about borders or security. The rise of international voices. Today, a new generation, especially among diaspora Jews and Western progressives, has begun to question the status quo. Palestinian voices, too, have found new platforms. Social media has allowed them to bypass traditional gatekeepers and tell their story raw, unfiltered, global. But even here, polarization thrives. Hashtags replace nuance. Anger replaces analysis. Echo chambers make it harder to hear each other. For decades, the world has played mediator, donor, cheerleader, and critic, sometimes all at once. Sacred promises and holy wounds. The theology behind the conflict. This is no ordinary land, and this is no ordinary conflict. From the outside, it looks political, about borders and armies and leaders. But under the soil of the Holy Land lies something older, deeper, harder to untangle. It is theology. It is scripture. You must listen to the sacred stories that shaped it. It is the belief that God Himself promised this land, and that promised echoes in every step taken, every stone thrown, every prayer whispered at the Western Wall or in a mosque in Ramallah. To understand this conflict, you can't just look at history. The covenant, a land promised in the book of Genesis. God speaks to a man named Abram, later known as Abraham. To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. The return to Zion was not a political ambition. It was a spiritual homecoming. It wasn't just a poetic line. It was a divine deed, a gift from God to His chosen people. Genesis 15:18, this covenant, the promise of land, became the cornerstone of Jewish theology. And when modern Zionism emerged in the late 1800s, it was as much about fulfilling prophecy as it was about escaping persecution. For millennia, This promise sustained Jewish identity through exile, through dispersion, through unimaginable suffering. To be Jewish was too long for Jerusalem, the prophets and the return, because their story didn't end in 1948. It fractured. The Dome of the Rock marks this event, standing proudly on the Haram al-Sharif, which Jews call the Temple Mount. The Hebrew Bible is filled with prophecies of return, a place where heaven touched earth. I will bring my people Israel back from exile. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. Amos 9:14. But now, with over 2 billion followers worldwide, Christianity plays a unique and often conflicted role in the narrative. Churches were built, then burned, and for centuries, the Holy Land became a pawn in a spiritual chess game. Can a country be born in a day or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Evangelical Christians began to see the rebirth of Israel as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Isaiah 66:8. Yet over time, Christian theology evolves, sometimes embracing Jewish restoration, other times condemning it. For Jews around the world, the rebirth of Israel in 1948 felt like these verses coming to life. A miracle, a divine intervention. But for Palestinians, Muslim and Christian alike, those same verses brought no comfort. Islam and the sanctity of the land. Churches raised money, pilgrimages were made, politicians lobbied, not just out of strategy, but out of sacred conviction. Islam also holds the land as sacred, especially Jerusalem, known in Arabic as Al. Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad was miraculously taken from Mecca to Jerusalem in a single night. The Israel and from there ascended into heaven. It is the third holiest site in Islam, and just like Jewish people, Muslims view stewardship of this land as a sacred trust, not a matter of conquest, but of divine command. So here we are, two faiths, each with holy texts, each with divine promises, each with deep roots in the soil, and a sense that to give up this land would be to give up on God. Christian theology, between empathy and empire. And then there's a third, fight, born in this land, rooted in Jewish scripture. Early Christians believed Jesus had fulfilled the law, making the physical land less important than the kingdom of heaven. They called for mercy, humility, repentance, not domination. During the Crusades, Christians waged bloody wars to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Evangelicals and modern Zionists. In the 20th century, a new Christian movement emerged, particularly in the United States. Verses from books like Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Revelation were reinterpreted through a prophetic lens. They pray the same Lord's Prayer, and yet they often feel invisible in the conversation. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. Their churches damaged, their voices drowned out. Ezekiel 36-24. Many evangelicals came to believe that Israel's return was a sign of the end times, a necessary step before the return of Christ. As a result, support for Israel became more than politics, it became theology. Theology as weapon and as wound, but here lies the danger. When theology becomes territorial, it stops listening, it stops weeping. When God is viewed as giving land to one group at the expense of another, the result is not peace but permanence of conflict. Jesus wept over Jerusalem. The Quran calls for justice and peace, to inspire revolutions and to excuse oppression. And yet Scripture can cut both ways. The Holy Land can once again live up to its name, not because one group claims it as exclusive, but because all who live there learn to share its sacredness. In the very same Bible that speaks of promised land, we also read, "You are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native-born." Leviticus 24:22, do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners. Exodus 23:9, the prophets cried for justice, not just land, Palestinian Christianity. The forgotten church in this storm of theology. One group is often forgotten, Palestinian Christians. They are the living descendants of the earliest Jesus followers churches in Bethlehem, Ramallah, and Nazareth that have survived for 2,000 years. They read the same Bible. Many have watched their homes demolished. They don't deny Israel's right to exist, but they cry out, what about our right to remain? Prophecy or politics? Here's the hard question. Are we interpreting prophecy, or are we performing it? Are sacred texts meant to predict history or shape it? Are Christians and Jews supporting policies because they are righteous, or because they are strategic to an end times timeline? The danger is turning faith into a map and using it to justify pain. A different vision of the Holy Land. Imagine for a moment a holy land not of conquest but of coexistence. Imagine the land not as a trophy of prophecy, but as a shared inheritance, a place where Abraham's children live not in rivalry, but in remembrance. This is not naive. This is biblical. The prophets dreamt of swords turned to plowshare. Each tradition has at its heart a vision not of dominance but of shalom, salam, peace. Theology has been used to build kingdoms and to break them, but it can also heal. Scripture can become a bridge, not a barricade. Living in the crossfire. Stories from both sides of the wall behind every headline. Every bombing, every political speech, there are people. People with names, with birthdays, with dreams. People who just want to raise their children, go to work, drink coffee on their porch, and walk their streets without fear. But in this land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, see, even normal life feels like resistance. To live here is to live with constant tension, sirens, checkpoints, curfews, surveillance, trauma that passes from parent to child like a bitter inheritance. A Palestinian father in Gaza. He wakes up each morning not knowing if electricity will be available, if water will run, or if drones will hover overhead. My son is 7. He has lived through 3 wars already. In Gaza, we meet Hussein, a school teacher in his 40s. He says, "But the walls are cracked, and so is the spirit of many children who sit silently, drawing tanks and planes instead of flowers and stars. I tell my children that peace is possible, but they only know war." He teaches English by candlelight during blackouts. He tries to keep his classroom a safe space. Still, he hopes. "If I lose hope," he says, "then the next generation loses everything." Her town is less than a mile from Gaza, and for over a decade, it's been hit by thousands of rockets. A Jewish mother just across the border, in the Israeli town of Stereth, lives Miriam, a mother of 3. "My children grew up knowing how to run, one hand over the head, the other on the heart." She describes the routine. "We have 15 seconds to find shelter when the siren sounds. People who used to walk to school or work in 5 minutes now take detours, lasting hours passing through checkpoints manned by armed guards. I don't know their names, but I cry for them, too." To Israelis, it represents safety, a shield against suicide bombings. Since its construction, attacks dropped significantly. She supports Israel's right to defend itself, but she also grieves for the children on the other side. "You hold your ID like it's a ticket to dignity. They're not my enemies." Builds homes he'll never be allowed to live in. The wall that divides and defines the separation barrier, what Israelis call the security fence, and Palestinians call the apartheid wall, runs for hundreds of kilometers. And Rami El-Hanan, an Israeli whose daughter was killed in a suicide bombing. It is made of concrete slabs, barbed wire, motion sensors. 2 Palestinians, it is a cage, and together they founded the Parents Sakala group of Israeli and Palestinian families united by shared sorrow, advocating for peace. It cuts through olive groves, villages, and even family properties. Once a majority Christian town, it is now mostly Muslim. Many Palestinian Christians have emigrated, caught between occupation and extremism, and so the wall becomes more than stone. It becomes a metaphor for distrust, for fear, for the belief that the only way to live is to separate. The checkpoint routine every morning. Thousands of Palestinians line up at military checkpoints to enter Israeli-controlled areas for work. Some have permits, some are turned away without explanation. A man named Feud from Bethlehem describes it like this: "You leave at 4 a.m., you stand in line for hours. Soldiers shout, dogs sniff, machines scan." He works in construction in Jerusalem. The quiet resistors, and yet in the shadows of despair, there are people who refuse to give up. Like Bassem Araman, a Palestinian former fighter whose daughter was killed by Israeli soldiers. Built on land Palestinians claim for a future state, these communities are often heavily guarded and subsidized. They found each other not as enemies but as grieving fathers. Below them, at the Western Wall, Jews sway in devotion. Tourists take selfies in between. Bassem says, "We can't change the past, but we can refuse to let it destroy the future." Christians in the middle. In Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus, the population is shrinking. Father Mitri Raheb, a Lutheran pastor in Bethlehem, says, "We live in the land of the Bible, but the Bible is often used against us. Each has its pain. An Israeli teen may never see what life is like behind the wall, and yet they rarely meet." His church runs schools, clinics, and art centers trying to keep Christian witness alive in a place where faith feels like an uphill climb. Settlements and daily friction in the West Bank. Israeli settlements continue to grow. Palestinians in nearby villages describe life under pressure, roads blocked, farmland seized, water diverted, a cafe where both peoples sip coffee and dare to dream. Amal, a Palestinian farmer, says, "We plant trees, they uproot them. We rebuild, they demolish. But every olive tree we plant is an act of faith." Life in Jerusalem. One city, two realities in Jerusalem. Jews and Arabs walk the same streets, but live vastly different lives. West Jerusalem is modern, well-funded, and majority Jewish. East Jerusalem, largely Palestinian, suffers from poor infrastructure, limited services, and political tension. To let the pain of the other person touch your own. At the Dome of the Rock, Muslims pray. The city pulses with holiness and heartbreak. Youth under occupation. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is what this does to young people. In Israeli schools, children learn about the Holocaust, about existential threats, about the need for a safe homeland. In Palestinian schools, children learn about the Nakba, about checkpoints, about dreams denied. Each narrative is real. A Palestinian teenager may never speak to a Jewish peer when humanity breaks through, but then once in a while something beautiful breaks through. An Israeli soldier who refuses to serve in the West Bank, citing conscience. A Palestinian youth who joins a joint summer camp with Israeli kids and learns to laugh across language. A rabbi and an imam planting trees together. A teacher writing joint curriculums. Small acts, quiet acts, but they matter. Because in this land, even hope is a kind of revolution. It's easy to talk about governments, armies, and resolutions, but it's much harder and more necessary to see the faces, to hear the names. The battle for the story, media, misinformation, and the war of words in every conflict. There are two wars. The war on the ground of bullets, bombs, and borders, and the war in the mind of headlines, hashtags, and history. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is fought not just with weapons, but with words, with camera angles, with news reports, with selective memory and carefully crafted narratives. Because whoever controls the story controls the sympathy. And in this land, sympathy can shift policy. Policy can shape borders, and borders decide who lives behind walls and who doesn't. The power of framing a single word can change everything. Terrorist or freedom fighter, security barrier or apartheid wall, self-defense or aggression, occupied or disputed. Each term carries not just meaning but moral weight. Israelis often speak of their actions as defensive, protecting citizens from attacks, ensuring national survival. Palestinians describe their resistance as a response to decades of occupation, oppression, and exile. Both claim justice, both claim victory, and both use the media to make their case. Western media. Whose side? In the West, especially in the United States, the media narrative has historically leaned toward Israel. After the Holocaust, global sympathy for the Jewish people was high. Israel was seen as a miraculous nation rising from the ashes of genocide, the underdog, the David among Goliath. But over time, as images of Palestinian suffering grew, bulldozed homes, injured children, grieving families, more people began to question the official stories. Two stories, two worlds. Social media, a double-edged sword. An Israeli mother shares footage of her family rushing to a bomb shelter. Now, the media is a battlefield. One outlet shows rockets fired from Gaza. Another shows Israeli airstrikes leveling apartment buildings. One headline says, "Clash erupts." Another says, "Israeli forces kill protesters." Same event. Then came social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and suddenly, ordinary people had global microphones. Old videos resurface as breaking news. Bots flood comment sections. Influencers share simplified takes that go viral but miss context. A Palestinian teen live streams a house demolition in Hebron. They keep us scrolling by keeping us angry. Now, truth spreads faster, but so does misinformation. Fake photos go viral, and in the chaos, nuance dies. A soldier aiming a gun at a boy. The power of images. Sometimes a single image does more than 1,000 debates. A child standing in rubble, a blood-stained, stuffed animal, a keffiyeh-covered protester throwing a stone at a tank. These images don't tell the whole story, but they tell a powerful one. and each side has learned how to use them to gain empathy, to justify action, to recruit support. The algorithm and the echo chamber, the platforms we use, are not neutral. The algorithms show us what we already agree with. They feed us outrage. They confirm our fears. A pro-Palestinian user sees a feed filled with settler violence, military raids, and UN resolutions. A pro-Israel user sees clips of Hamas rockets, anti-Semitic protests, and burned Israeli buses. Each believes they have the truth. Each sees the other as blind or malicious, and so the digital wall becomes even higher than the physical one. Silencing and censorship in Israel. Press access is tightly controlled in military zones. In some cases, voices are silenced entirely. Palestinian journalists have had their pages removed. Pro-Israel accounts face coordinated flagging. Entire news outlets are banned in certain countries. In Gaza, Hamas censors dissent, martyrs glorified, enemies demonized. Information becomes a weapon, and those who tell uncomfortable truths often become targets themselves. The role of propaganda. Both Israeli and Palestinian factions have used propaganda for decades. Flyers dropped from planes, cartoons on children's TV, school textbooks filled with nationalistic framing. This isn't new. Without knowing the history, without meeting the people, and in doing so, they risk reducing sacred suffering to such. But it's dangerous because it doesn't just shape how people think about the conflict. It shapes how children grow up inside it. They learn fear before they learn math. They memorize slogans before they read stories, and the cycle continues. When Western voices speak, in recent years, celebrities, influencers, and even pastors have spoken out. Some boldly support Israel, citing scripture, security, and sovereignty. Others stand with Palestine, pointing to occupation, injustice, and inequality. But often, these voices speak without full context. The conflict becomes a trend, a hashtag, and the humanity gets lost. Narratives within narratives. Here's the truth. There isn't just one truth. There are many truths, layered, painful, personal. The Jewish grandmother whose family fled Nazi Europe and found safety in Israel. The Palestinian grandfather who still holds the key to a house that no longer exists. The Christian priest in Jerusalem who pleads for peace in a language no one listens to. Each carries a piece of the story. None carries all of it. The risk of a single story. Author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie once warned about the danger of a single story. In this conflict, single stories are seductive. They started it. They're the aggressors. They don't want peace. They're terrorists. They're occupiers. They just want to survive. But every story has a backstory, and every backstory has blood, tears, and longing. A new kind of journalism. Some groups are trying to change how we tell the story. Organizations like Plus 972 Magazine, Bethlehem, and Breaking the Silence offer insider reporting, filtered, raw, and often uncomfortable. They don't tell you what to believe. They just show you what's happening on both sides of the wall. And in a world full of noise, that kind of truth is revolutionary. The battle for land is visible, but the battle for narrative, for hearts and minds, is just as fierce. And unless we learn to listen, not just react, not just repost, but really listen, we will keep fighting shadows instead of building bridges. Global hands in holy soil. How world powers fuel the fire. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict may be rooted in local land and ancient stories, but its flames are fanned by global winds. Foreign governments fund it. International organizations debate it. Armies on the other side of the world train and equip players in it. This is not just a regional dispute, it's a global chessboard, and millions of lives are pawns. The United States, ally, broker, enabler. No country has shaped Israel's destiny more than the United States. Since Israel's founding, the US has been its closest ally, providing over $150 billion in aid, most of it military. American support includes fighter jets, missile defense systems like Iron Dome, and advanced surveillance tech. The Trump peace plan. US presidents have tried, sometimes sincerely, to broker peace. The Camp David Accords in 1978, the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, the Annapolis Conference. But while the rhetoric promotes peace, the actions often reinforce power imbalances. When Israeli airstrikes hit Gaza, the US calls for restraint, but keeps the weapons flowing. When Palestinians seek recognition at the UN, the US vetoes it. When settlements expand, the US expresses concern but rarely acts. Too many in the region. The US is not an honest broker. It's Israel's lawyer aunt occasionally, its arms dealer, Iran. Resistance or proxy warfare. On the other side of the spectrum stands Iran, a theocratic regime with ambitions of regional dominance and deep enmity toward Israel. Iran funds and arms Hamas in Gaza, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. To Iran, supporting Palestinian resistance isn't just solidarity, it's strategy. Keeping Israel distracted, weakened, and encircled strengthens Iran's influence across the Arab world. But Iran's involvement has consequences. It empowers militant factions, it undermines diplomacy, and it gives Israel justification for its own militarization. The result? More violence, less peace. The Gulf states, quiet deals and cold calculations. Once, the Arab world stood united behind the Palestinian cause, but in recent years, that unity has cracked. Under the Abraham Accords, countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan normalized relations with Israel without Palestinian input. To these nations, economics and security, especially against Iran, took priority over old loyalties. And though they still offer rhetorical support for Palestinians, behind the scenes, many are building trade deals, intelligence, cooperation, and even arms agreements with Israel. Palestinians see it as betrayal, a peace without justice. Saudi Arabia, the crown jewel in waiting. All eyes are now on Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, guardian of Mecca and Medina. Behind closed doors, Saudi and Israeli officials have already met, exchanged intelligence, and discussed potential normalization. The US is heavily pressuring Riyadh to formalize ties with Israel in exchange for defense guarantees and nuclear technology. But Saudi Arabia demands concessions for Palestinians in return, a revival of the two-state vision, or at least gestures toward it. Will they settle for symbolism or hold firm for substance? He hosts Hamas leaders, denounces Israeli actions, and portrays himself as a defender of Jerusalem. Time will tell. Turkey and Qatar, speaking loudly, acting strategically. Turkey's President Erdogan is a vocal supporter of Palestinian rights. Yet Turkey also maintains trade relations with Israel and uses the conflict to boost domestic political support. Qatar, meanwhile, finances Gaza's civil infrastructure and sometimes even pays salaries for Hamas-run government workers. They walk a delicate line, funding the flame but claiming to douse it. The European Union. Words without weight. Europe often speaks in the language of diplomacy. Concerned, deeply troubled, monitoring the situation. But on the ground, European influence is limited. The EU funds Palestinian schools, hospitals, and NGOs but rarely challenges Israel on settlement expansion or military operations in a meaningful way. And when they do, Israel accuses them of bias, anti-Semitism, or interference. Disruption in the Middle East gives Moscow room to maneuver elsewhere. So Europe whispers while bombs fall. But it avoids involvement in the details, focusing instead on oil, trade, and expanding its global belt and road footprint. Russia and China, opportunistic spectators. Russia portrays itself as a counterbalance to US influence. It maintains ties with both Israel and Palestinian factions, but its primary interest is not peace, it's leverage. China publicly calls for calm, supports Palestinian statehood in theory, and signs economic deals with both sides. Both are players, not peacemakers. The UN, a stage 4 symbolism. The United Nations has passed hundreds of resolutions condemning occupation, settlement expansion, and the treatment of Palestinians. But few of those resolutions have teeth. Why? Because the US wields a veto at the Security Council, and most enforcement requires consensus among global powers who rarely agree. So the UN becomes a theater, one where Palestinians speak, Israel rebuts, the world listens, and then moves on. NGOs and the grassroots struggle while governments play chess. Grassroots organizations continue the real work. Groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, B'Tselem, and Breaking the Silence document abuses on all sides. They face threats, funding cuts, travel bans, and propaganda attacks, but they persist because truth, even when powerless, still matters. A global hypocrisy. What makes this conflict so incendiary is the global double standard. The West condemns Russia for occupying Ukraine but funds Israel's occupation of the West Bank. Iran backs militias in Lebanon but decries Zionist aggression. Arab leaders weep for Gaza then crush protests in their own cities. Everyone claims the moral high ground, but few walk it. What if the world really tried? What if the world treated this conflict not as a PR issue but as a human emergency? What if weapons shipments were halted until peace talks resumed? What if aid was conditional on upholding rights? What if powerful nations put pressure on both sides, not just the convenient one? It wouldn't solve everything, but it might change the calculus. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not just a regional tragedy. It is a global failure of diplomacy, of ethics, of courage. Until world powers choose justice over alliances, peace will remain an illusion. What would peace even look like? We've walked through history. We've witnessed occupation, resistance, terror, and tragedy. We've watched world powers use this sacred land like a board game. But after all of it, the real question lingers like smoke in the air. Can there ever be peace? Not just a ceasefire, not just quiet, but real, lasting, transformative peace. What peace isn't. Peace is not just the absence of war. Peace is not walls and checkpoints and drones patrolling silence. Peace isn't found in one side winning while the other submits. Peace isn't negotiated by men in suits thousands of miles away. Peace doesn't begin with slogans or with flags or even with treaties. Peace begins with truth, and truth is messy. The hard truths both sides must face. For Israelis, the truth may sound like this: the Holocaust was real. Jewish people needed refuge, but that need does not justify endless occupation. Fear is real, but fear cannot become policy. Settlements on stolen land are not security. Not every Palestinian is a terrorist. For Palestinians, the truth might be: the Nakba was real. Families were driven out, but not every Israeli is a colonizer. Rockets won't free Gaza. Martyrdom won't build a nation. Hamas does not equal liberation. These are hard truths, but they are where healing starts. The people behind the politics. We've spent so long talking about borders and bombs that we forget this is about people. A teenage girl in Tel Aviv who dreams of backpacking in Europe but is afraid of the next bus bombing. A father in Gaza who teaches math during the day and prays his children survive the night. A settler who believes God gave him this land. A refugee who believes God has abandoned him. They are not hashtags. They are not headlines. They are human beings. What peace could actually look like? Real peace won't come from domination but from mutual dignity. Maybe it's two states, side by side with real sovereignty and real recognition. Maybe it's one binational state with equal rights for Jews, Muslims, Christians, and atheists alike. Maybe it's something we haven't imagined yet, but whatever the model, it must include equal rights under law, freedom of movement, a reckoning with the past, not a rewriting of it, justice for the displaced, security for the afraid, forgiveness, the unthinkable path. Peace also demands something almost unthinkable: forgiveness, not forgetfulness, not pretending it didn't happen, but the brave act of releasing vengeance. A Palestinian mother embracing the idea that the Israeli soldier who shot her son is still human. An Israeli survivor of a stabbing choosing not to hate every Arab man who looks like the attacker. That kind of forgiveness doesn't come from politics. It comes from the heart, and maybe only from God. The role of faith. This is a land soaked in holy history. Jews pray at the Western Wall. Muslims bow at Allah. Christians walk the Via Dolorosa. If any place should model peace, it is this place. The God of Abraham is not a God of apartheid, occupation, or revenge. He is the God of justice, of mercy, of shalom. And so maybe, just maybe, peace begins, not in policy but in prayer. The youth, breaking the cycle. The old men have tried and failed, but the youth Israeli and Palestinian are different. They text each other across walls. They share playlists and memes and pain. They're tired of funerals. They're tired of fighting their grandparents' wars. They want to live together, apart, in peace. Maybe they're naive, but maybe naivety is what we need. The question we must all ask: where do you stand in this story? Not which side do you support, but what kind of world are you helping create? Do your words build bridges or burn them? Do your prayers include your enemy? Do you speak truth even when it's uncomfortable? This conflict doesn't need more cheerleaders. It needs peacemakers. Hope against the odds. History says this conflict is unsolvable. That peace is impossible. That blood will forever follow belief. In Rwanda, but history is not destiny, and peace is not a fantasy. We've seen it in South Africa, in Northern Ireland, Not perfect peace, but miraculous transformation. If it can happen there, why not here? Not just the stones, not just the shrines. Final words. The world watches this land. The world debates it, weeps for it, weaponizes it. But God still sees it. The people, the child in Gaza, the rabbi in Jerusalem, the imam in Ramallah, the Christian pilgrim with tears in their eyes. This land is not cursed, it is sacred, and sacred things deserve peace. A prayer for peace. Let me close with this simple prayer for both peoples. God of Abraham, God of Isaac and Ishmael, God of Sarah and Hagar, break the cycle of hate, heal the wounds of memory, tear down the walls we've built in our hearts. Give leaders the courage to speak truth. Give the oppressed the strength to hope. Give the powerful the humility to change. And let peace flow down like a river, across the checkpoints, through the camps, into every home, until swords become plowshares and enemies become neighbors a man. Thank you for joining this journey. If you found this meaningful, consider sharing it with someone who still believes in peace. This has been why there will never be peace between Israel and Palestine. But maybe, just maybe, there could be